Good day, everybody. My name is Michael Fiebig with Fiebig Architecture, and today we're going to start a new series on the history of modern building codes. And in this series, we're going to go over the history of those early codes that grew and evolved and changed into what we now use to govern the design and construction of modern buildings. Typically, we all use the International Building Code and all of the accessory codes that go along with it. But really, how did we get there? Like, where's the origins of the International Building Code? Where does that come from? So, in this series, we're going to talk about that, the history of modern building codes. And in this part one of this series, we're going to be going over building codes of the late 19th and early 20th century. We're going to be going over insurance companies and fire underwriters because, as you will see, a big drive for building regulation actually came from fires and from fire hazards. And once people realized that this was kind of a big deal, rules and regulations began to be proposed and enforced that would govern fire safety in modern construction, and that was one of the reasons why we have building codes that we have today. So we're going to be talking about the insurance companies, fire underwriters, and then the fire underwriters building code, which was introduced at the very beginning of the 20th century. And then in part two, we'll follow up with some other early building codes and some early city and state codes. So this lesson is intended as a study of what we would consider to be the modern form of the building code, that is, a code of rules and regulations laid out in book form for ease of reference and uniformity of application in the post-industrial world. So kind of just boxing us in here, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about ancient building rules and regulations or things through like the medieval history or other things. We're focused on modern building codes because while it is true that there are ancient examples of building rules, like you can see here, the ancient Code of Hammurabi actually did have rules for building and construction, and even in the Bible has what some would say building rules and regulations. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the ancient stuff. We're talking about modern stuff. So here's where we're going to start. By the end of the 1800s, consider what the Industrial Revolution had done to civilization. We began to see cities becoming very dense and urbanized. As the Industrial Revolution transformed major economies from agrarian into industrial, rather than disperse and populations dispersed throughout large areas, we began to see urbanization of cities. And throughout the second part of the 1800s, as the Industrial Revolution really took hold, cities were growing very fast and they were becoming more dense and more urbanized, but there were no building codes. And so what was happening is people were building with combustible materials, very dense, in very dense applications. And what began to happen is that large scale, massive fires eventually began to occur. So an example of that is the 1835 Great Fire of New York, which covered 17 city blocks. I mean, that's a massive fire. The St. Louis Fire of 1849 destroyed a significant part of the city. Here's a photo of or an artist's rendering of the 1835 Great Fire of New York. The San Francisco Fire of 1851 was a massive fire that destroyed as much as 3/4 of the city. If you know anything about San Francisco, it's an incredibly dense city, and just imagine what could happen in with density of that level, with no fire protection or fireproofing, and combustible wood buildings that just created a massive fire that took out a huge chunk of the city. Another one is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. 3.3 square miles that fire was. It's hard for us to imagine what that actually would look like, because we live in a time now where we benefit from modern building codes that prevent this sort of thing from happening. But these fires did happen, and the response to that was actually, believe it or not, one of the first drivers of change as it relates to this was insurance companies, specifically fire underwriters, because insurance companies are nothing new. It's not a brand new invention. They had insurance back then, and obviously this was a problem for insurance companies trying to cover losses of such massive damage. So after enough of these fires occurred, people got the clue, and they're like, we need to do something about this. So before municipal regulation could take hold, insurance companies used their own incentives to push for a safer building. And basically what that looked like was the insurance companies wrote their own codes, and if you wanted your building to be insured, you would have to agree to follow the insurance company's rules and regulations. So here we have a copy of the building code recommended by the National Board of Fire Underwriters in New York. So these very early building codes, number one, you can see it's recommended. This code by itself was not a legally adopted or legally enforced standard. It was from an insurance company or from the National Board of Fire Underwriters, but they were putting this out as recommendations, and they did encourage cities and municipalities to adopt it and enforce it. But interestingly, they're the ones who wrote this code. And as you can imagine, it was really focused on fire protection. This early code, contrary to modern codes that we use nowadays, really was focused on two things. Those two things being structural stability, make sure the building's not going to collapse, that it is a stable building, and two, fire and life safety. Those were the two most important aspects of a safe building. And so it makes sense that it would be written by the fire underwriters. They had the most at stake in this sort of thing. And so the first edition was printed in 1905. This picture is of the second edition in 1907. Ultimately, this code did find a lot of success and eventually developed into the National Building Code, which was published through 1976. Interestingly, we can actually, by reading the foreword, the opening to this building code, you can get kind of a flavor for the mindset of the people at that time who wrote this. And it reads as follows: thousands of human lives and millions of dollars worth of property have been sacrificed by the criminal folly of erecting unsafe or defective buildings. So long as those in authority permit such buildings to be erected, neither life nor property can be safe. A remedy safeguarding both may be found in this book. The vital importance of its principles should arouse municipal authorities everywhere to a realizing sense of their duty and to the grave responsibility that rests upon them to enact and enforce adequate building laws for the protection of life and property. So that's the mindset, right? They're like, we need rules. This is too important to just leave unregulated, because what happens? Well, we know what happens: massive urban fires and lots of damage and loss of life. So we take for granted now the necessity of a building code, but there was a time where it didn't exist, and so these were some of the reasons why the pressure was on to form these codes. So interestingly, this code, because it's so primitive, I suppose, compared to what we rely on nowadays, it is definitely a much more difficult and I guess a good way to put it is just it's a crude code. It's not organized in the way that modern codes are. For example, there's no such thing as construction type classification or occupancy group assignments, which, if you're familiar with the modern International Building Code, those are the two most important factors that go into determining how to provide a safe building, structurally, fire protection, and otherwise, is the construction type, meaning what the building is made of. Primarily, that's combustible versus non-combustible materials, and the degree of fireproofing applied to those combustible or non-combustible materials. Or the occupancy group, which is what is the intended use of the building. Different occupancy groups have different densities of occupants. Think of like a theater where you have a dense packed amount of occupants versus like a storage warehouse where you're just not going to have very many occupants, versus as well the amount of time that people spend in these buildings. Business occupancies typically are not going to be occupied 24 hours a day, versus residential and institutional occupancies, which are going to be occupied 24/7. So we have the benefit of relying on these standards that have been developed now in our modern world, but early codes, it just didn't have it. So it's very hard to try to find out what the rules actually were. But it was a primitive code, but they started somewhere, and of course the code did continue to develop. So by the time we hit the 1922 edition, ideas such as classifying a building by its use, which again, that would be an occupancy group, and classifying the building into what it's made of, meaning combustible, non-combustible, fireproof, those became standards for building classification. You can see here in the 1922 edition, we now have a new section where we classify the building by construction. That's section 10 here. Interestingly enough, we've got 3 construction types. You've got frame construction, non-fireproof construction, which is subset into ordinary and mill construction, and then you've got your fireproof construction. So the interesting thing is mill construction, you can see where they define that. Mill construction, sometimes called slow burning construction, is a building having masonry walls and heavy timber interior construction. So if you're familiar with the modern IBC, you'll recognize that this is now what we call type 4 heavy timber construction, or if you're looking at the 2021 IBC or later, type 4, it could be mass timber as well, but essentially that's heavy timber construction. They called it mill construction because it literally was solid sawn lumber pieces. It wasn't engineered wood elements the way we typically rely nowadays. It was just solid pieces of heavy timber. And then above that, you have ordinary construction, which eventually turned into what we call type 3 construction. Some people still actually refer to type 3 colloquially as ordinary construction, but it's really, it was ordinary back during this time, like in the 1920s. This was ordinary, right? Which was masonry, block exterior walls, and then wood floor joists, wood roof construction. It was one of the most common, it was the most common form of commercial construction back then. That's why they called it ordinary, because it was ordinary to the times. Not so much nowadays though, but the main ideas of type 3 construction are non-combustible exterior walls, which would be the concrete or the block, and then combustible interior elements, the floors and the roof and things like that. And then you can see in section 11, classification of buildings by occupancy. So now we've got kind of an early occupancy group classification. You got public buildings, residence buildings, and business buildings. Those were it. Those were the 3. They started there, and as time developed, both the construction types and occupancy groups began to expand. So this code continued to be revised and reissued. This is the 1943 edition. In the 1943 edition, now we've got a table here, which is, you may be familiar with something like this. It's very similar to what we have in our modern codes, as far as this is allowable heights of buildings, but it's based on the occupancy group, which is on the far left column, depending on the use of the building. And then on the top, you've got your construction classification from fireproof all the way through unprotected. And then depending on the occupancy group and the construction type, this tells you how high the building can be. So we can kind of see how these codes are beginning to provide area and height limitations on buildings based on how risky the buildings are. So you can see like for frame, so like a stick frame or unprotected wood frame, we've got height restrictions here that are very conservative versus where you have fireproof and semi-fireproof buildings. Those can be a lot bigger, and that makes sense, right? Because if you have a building made of fireproofed non-combustible materials, that's going to be very safe compared to buildings of unprotected wood frame. So we see as these codes, these early codes developed, that we're beginning to limit the size of buildings based on their safety. And of course, their safety is determined based on what the building is made of and what the building is intended to be used for. So this code it did change. They rebranded it as the National Building Code. You can still see on the bottom, still recommended by the National Board of Fire Underwriters. But at this point, they now called it the National Building Code. And we had more construction type and occupancy group development, where now we've got buildings are being occupied by more diverse classifications than what previously existed. Residence building, business building, storage building, mixed occupancy, and then doubtful classification, which nowadays we have type U occupancy group for miscellaneous or if unknown. Classification of construction. And this particular code, remember, we went from 3 construction types in 1922. Now we have 7 in 1949. And a general equivalent to modern, the modern International Building Code can be seen here. It's not exact, but it's a general equivalent. But the point being, we're still kind of trying to work out what's the best way to classify these buildings. So with that, that's the end of part 1. I hope you look forward to part 2 of this, where we'll dig into a few other early building codes and also go over some early city and state codes as well. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all next time.